I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, I have a conversation with Amy Aronson, author of the new book, Crystal Eastman, A Revolutionary Life. And if you haven't heard of Crystal Eastman, you're probably not alone. She was one of the most progressive feminists of the early 20th century, and she was also branded the most dangerous woman in America. Crystal Eastman was an uncompromising feminist. She was also an early advocate for workers' rights and a self-branded socialist and an anti-militarist. There are two other important facts about Crystal Eastman's life. She helped to write the Equal Rights Amendment. Crystal Eastman was also the co-founder of the ACLU. So one of my very first questions about Crystal Eastman's life is why she faded from history and why there's so little information about her. So here is author Amy Aronson explaining why she thinks that is.
I think the main reason that Crystal Eastman has kind of disappeared from or is obscure in the historical record is because of what really was a kind of intersectional mindset, an intersectional outlook in her activism. What I mean by that is that Eastman involved herself in, multiple movements and, many of the major social movements of the 20th century and believed that they were all linked together and worked throughout her career to try to link them together, all under one kind of vast emancipatory rubric. She believed and she recognized that there were commonalities among various forms of oppression. And she tried to kind of straddle multiple movements and bring them together in order to combat, all of those common sources of oppression and inequality at once. So she spent a lot of her time, talking about socialism and anti-imperialism and also, maternity and maternalism with feminists. She spent a lot of time talking about feminism and pacifism with socialists and with revolutionaries. And one of the outcomes of this was that Eastman always seemed to be kind of straddling so many different movements at once that her voice often, seemed insurgent or challenging from within each individual movement. Many of her colleagues felt that they weren't sure where she stood because she was trying to straddle so many different movements at once. Because when she talked to, say, feminists about socialism, it seemed like a challenge from within. And so this kind of complicated her status and her stature within the movements that she was affiliated with, within the movements that she built her life on, at the same time as her radicalism and her activism challenged her kind of standing in the more mainstream political and social environments, right? She was a radical, so she was already challenging to more mainstream views. But because of that, she needed a stronger sense of belonging, I think, clearer sense of standing within the protest movements, the leftist movements that she collectively saw as her political home. And so what happened was she, kind of fell through the planks of history. She fell through the planks of historical memory. She didn't have clear and consistent connections with organizations. With a single organization, right, or a single cause. She didn't have clear and consistent alliances or relationships to various mentors who were recognized. The things that signal stature and make someone intelligible and make someone visible in historical memory, she kind of challenged and complicated at every turn, and precisely because she, tried to connect them all to a larger vision of change that they all shared. And so in some ways it was a kind of I think a tragic irony that her inclusive vision seemed to divide people and seemed to divide people's loyalties. But in other ways, it's also a kind of a fascinating story of how we tell stories, how and why we remember people that I think, has a lot to tell us about our current intersectional environment for forming coalitions to pursue the same social change that she and others have been pursuing for a century, and counting.
So is it oversimplistic to say that she was possibly a victim of her own prolificacy? Like she was so prolific and involved in so many movements that she wasn't known for a single thing? Or was it that and maybe some hostility because she was seen as kind of an insurgent in lots of these movements?
I wouldn't say hostility, but I would say that, she challenged people. She challenged organizational hierarchies and leadership, in various organizations. And so there were some leaders. She had, quite a run-in with Alice Paul, for example, particularly after the vote was won, when the militant wing of the women's movement, the National Women's Party, was starting to figure out, okay, what comes next? It was in that period, before the rise of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923, and that they were, searching for, okay, what's our next approach? And Eastman wanted a very intersectional, kind of transnational feminist movement, and Paul wanted a much more focused, targeted women's campaign, just much like the suffrage movement that they had just successfully completed. So for some leaders, there was that that sense that they were being challenged from a colleague. For others, it was the fact that her kind of intersectional perspective, as well as her movement to the left after the Russian Revolution, seemed too radical, and seemed to push the organizations that she was associated with in more radical directions than many of the progressive leaders in those organizations were comfortable with.
Yeah, wow, that's unfortunate. She reminds me of just reading her story and, kind of the emotionality of it and the arc of her life. She reminds me of not Elizabeth Rankin, but I can't believe I can't remember her name. The very first woman who ran for president, who was called
Victoria Woodhull.
Yeah,
yes,
Mrs.
she was
Satan.
Awesome. Yes, she scared the crap out of people.
Yes,
Victoria Woodhull.
So I don't know, just something about her demeanor, and it's hard to tell from a book, but just something about it just kind of reminds me of that, a similar kind of radical woman, a radical feminist
yes.
Around that time.
Crystal was just unafraid. She was so bold, and she asserted her freedom. She really, she claimed a freedom and claimed a world that even while she was trying to create it. So she was, in kind of a real sense, a woman ahead of herself or ahead of her time. I know that's kind of a cliche, and as historians, we're not really supposed to say that. What struck me about her early on, what first I think stuck with me from my graduate school days till, almost 20 years later when I finally, sat down to try to write the book, was the sense of a woman who was just calling ahead of herself and, and in envisioning and reaching for, and actively demanding and trying to live in a world that was much closer to mine than it was to hers. And, I found that just so compelling. It's visionary. I think she was a gripping person, and I find her story gripping because of that.
Right. She had some really, really progressive stances. And, you mentioned a few, feminism. And she was also, I think, a socialist. She called herself a socialist, right?
Yes,
and
absolutely.
She was for reproductive rights.
Yes, very much so.
Why was she branded, and I want to go through the historical arc of her life a bit later, but why was she branded the most dangerous woman in America?
Well, most of those claims about her came in her most radical or revolutionary period. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, she and her brother, Max Eastman, much better known than she is, a radical writer and editor of the Masses magazine. The two of them together published the Liberator magazine, which they started in 1918, shortly after the Russian Revolution, and it was called the Journal of Revolutionary Progress. And it became very quickly the kind of center of reporting and information about revolutionary movements worldwide. In connection with that period in her politics, which I can explain to you a little bit how she kind of evolved into that radicalism from her more progressive earlier activism. In connection with that, she took very forthright, very bold, very outspoken stances in favor of the Bolsheviks, and herself traveled to communist Hungary, and she was the first American reporter to do that, and reported very enthusiastically, at least initially, about her hopes that a similar revolution would come to the United States and would indeed sweep the world, would become a global revolutionary movement. And of course, this kind of radicalism, she was not alone in it, particularly on the left after the Russian Revolution. Many of her colleagues from a number of different movements also celebrated revolution. However, it still was not a mainstream view. Even on the left, it was not a mainstream view. It was a radical view, and it was very threatening to people, especially in the body of a woman and the voice of someone who was so unafraid to speak about it, and the voice of someone who had such stature in more mainstream political movements and more mainstream political venues. That, it was very threatening to power structures, both economically and politically. And so it was at that time, like many other radicals, she became labeled as this very dangerous woman, as kind of as an enemy within.
Right. Well, speaking of her brother Max, right, who was much, more well known than she was, she had some really interesting family dynamics growing up, right?
Yes.
One of her brothers died when he was very young. Was he 7 years old? Is that right?
Yes. Her brother Morgan. And he died of scarlet fever, which Crystal Eastman also had, although she survived it, obviously. But Morgan's death affected the family and particularly affected her mother, whom Crystal absolutely worshipped and was extraordinarily close to. And, kind of changed the family dynamic in a number of important ways. But one of the outcomes of this for Crystal and Max Eastman was, an incredibly tight bonding with their mother. Crystal and Max and Annis Ford Eastman, their mother, formed the kind of a core of the family unit, very close, and, had a kind of attachment and a kind of language for each other and a kind of communication with each other that bordered on romantic attachments. And the kind of, romantic language that you find in Crystal's letters with her mother, in Crystal's letters later with her brother Max, and in some of the letters between Annis and Max as well, really, carries a very unusual emotional charge. But they were seriously bonded together to the exclusion of some of the other members of the family, at the core of a family where Crystal's father, Sam Eastman, was, very much on the margins, and in fact was kind of cast out of the house in many ways by Crystal's mother. He was banished from her bed after Max was born, and over the years ended up, sort of camping out and literally living, outside the house in their summer home, their summer cottage, upstate New York. But so her father and also her older brother, Anstis, later called Ford Eastman, also was, kind of on the outs in the family. And so there were a lot of charged and difficult dynamics within the family caused by this central character of her mother, whom she worshipped, and the ways that she constructed a very tight inner loving triangle between herself, her daughter, her only daughter, and her youngest son, Max.
Well, her father, and I want to get back to her mother in a minute, because her mother is a really, really interesting character. But Incredible. Her father, they both are very supportive of Crystal's early, ideas about feminism. Like even when she was a young girl, she would insist on the boys and the girls in the house, or the girl, she was the only daughter, Correct. Having an equal amount of chores, right? Which is very kind of, I think, progressive during that time, during the late, 19th century. Yeah, but her mother, and I just want to talk about this a bit, because you mentioned that there was kind of this romantic overtone between, within that family dynamic. And I was reading through some of the letters in the book. You recall some letters and some diaries. And I was just curious if that was unusual for the time. I mean, her mother would write things like, "You are my life, and no one has ever loved me as you do." I mean, did Crystal ever express that as a burden, or did she see it as problematic? Or was that just kind of, I don't know, all she understood relationships should be?
I think that she, in her life, she never expressed any problem with it. In fact, she adored her mother. The final piece of writing that she ever published, her only autobiographical piece of writing, was called Mother Worship. It was actually her only autobiographical piece of writing became a kind of biographical piece of writing about her mother. And so she had, an incredible sense of attachment, almost a blurring or a merger with her mother's life in many ways. Nevertheless, I think in reading her life and in studying her life, that relationship with her mother did, cause her to sort of form ideas and form a kind of emotional life that made it hard for her to work with precisely the other women with whom she was often working in many of the social movements, particularly feminism, obviously, but also there, many of her colleagues in various progressive causes were, kind of senior, important women: Jane Addams, Florence Kelley, Lillian Wald. I mean, very important progressive, activist, innovative women. And she had difficulty often with them. She had difficulty with boundaries. She had difficulty with attachments, with loyalties. Early in her life, when she first met Florence Kelley, she was working on the Pittsburgh survey and starting to do the work that led to her work on workers' compensation. And she first met Florence Kelley, and of course, she respected her a lot and wrote a letter to her mother saying how much she respected her, and yet compared her unfavorably to her own mother, saying that Florence Kelley was just not as lovely as her own mother. And I think in many ways, no woman ever quite measured up to her own mother, despite their accomplishments, because of that feeling of emotional charge and that feeling of complete understanding and that feeling that her mother gave her that she, Crystal, was the rarest of possible human beings, and who she and only she, Crystal and only Crystal, could accomplish things with her vision that nobody else could. And it helped to make Crystal have a difficult time collaborating and, kind of working with other senior women, I think, and also in having perspective on her own vision to, kind of ever compromise or ever reframe her perspective.
But she struggled with feelings of inadequacy, right? Because of her mother's, view of her. Is that true?
Yes, because of her mother's view of her and because of her own view of her mother. Her view that her mother was so exceptional, was so perfect, was so golden in so many ways. And it, kind of those feelings, those overwhelming feelings of love blinded her to some of the ways in which her mother put undue pressure on her, the ways that her mother actually divided the family that meant so much to her to keep together, kind of banished her brother and her father to the outer reaches, to a kind of darker, colder part of the universe. And, the ways in which her mother depended on her to kind of rescue her and bring her out of. Her mother struggled with, I believe, manic depression. And she depended on Crystal and told Crystal she was depending on her to pull her out of her depressive episodes, and often said that Crystal and only Crystal had the power to do it, to save her, to rescue her, to save her life. And, these pressures, even though Crystal never, to my knowledge, acknowledged them in any letter and any extant piece of writing, they had to have weighed on her. And certainly in reading some of her interactions and comments about other women in her life and knowing the ways that she worked effectively with people and the times when she didn't, I think there were ramifications from that relationship that even Crystal herself did not recognize.
Ready for your next adventure? KLM Royal Dutch Airlines brings you Real Deal Days, your chance to uncover real adventures and create real memories. Taste the real Amsterdam, explore the real Barcelona, and discover the real Johannesburg, along with many more destinations around the world. Secure your real deal today and seize the moment with KLM Royal Dutch Airlines. Restrictions apply. See terms and conditions at klm.com.
Right. Well, so she went off to college, right? Which is where I think she first was introduced to socialism. I think it was at Columbia.
Actually, she called herself a socialist for the first time at Vassar College as an undergraduate.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
How did that inform her early ideas that led to this work in advocacy? Which is kind of, because her family was rather religious, right? So it seems like a departure. It doesn't seem to go in the same direction for me. So I'm just curious about that.
Yes. Her family, she was the daughter of two ordained congregational ministers. And certainly her family was religious in the kind of structure of their lives. Her mother became the family breadwinner and was quite a renowned minister in her time, a renowned woman minister in her time. Her mother became a doubter. Moved, eventually left the congregational faith and moved to Unitarianism, and eventually planned before she died to leave the church altogether. Partly because of her manic depression, I think, and her sort of emotional travails, she found it difficult to maintain her sense of faith. And partly because she was such a searcher, such a seeker, that a lot of her questions did not seem answered. by her religious faith. Furthermore, I think, she struggled with the limitations that the faith generally assumed and placed upon women, and, kind of other issues connected to her own life and her own experience of her identity.
Right, because she talked a lot about the role of the woman in the church and in the family, and she used words like sacrifice pretty often. So she seemed like quite a feminist herself, and I would imagine that would informed Crystal to some extent.
Absolutely. Really, Crystal's socialist perspective, certainly, and definitely her feminism, and definitely her anti-militarism, came almost directly from her mother. Max Eastman, wrote about the fact that an anti-war attitude was the family heritage, and what he meant by that was that it came, from their mother's side. Certainly, their father also, Sam Eastman was a pacifist and wrote an important pacifist brochure that was published by the American Union Against Militarism, the organization that Crystal was one of the two main anti-war organizations Crystal was involved with and a leader in. So it's not like he didn't hold those views, but, the stronger, sense of inheritance and what really, really shaped her politics and her, her attitude toward the world was the impact and the input from her mother.
So she graduates from college and she is looking for a job. And so I think she applies initially to a law firm, a position that she didn't get. And she ended up taking her first job with something that kind of changed the trajectory of her professional and her life in activism, right? She was hired to catalog and report on workplace injuries. And I just want to say that this was at the height, I believe, of the Industrial Revolution, where, there were almost no worker protection laws and, almost no child labor laws at this point, right?
Correct. Yes. That was all of that labor legislation was sort of in the process of being formed. And many of the activists that she lived and worked with, beginning in law school at NYU when she lived at the Greenwich House settlement, and, certainly extending through her work on workplace accidents and workers' compensation, where there were waves of labor legislation that various organizations and groups and activists were trying to get implemented and put into place. But yes, Crystal Eastman always wanted to practice law. Even, to the very end of her life. I would say the last numbers of years when she was mainly a working mother, less so, but all the way up through her anti-war activism and even into her years with the Liberator magazine, she wanted to be a lawyer. She believed in the courts. She saw a lot of hope in the courts, and she was always trying to test the principles of America, often through the courts. However, in the early 20th century, the legal profession, resisted the entrance of women more so than many other professions, even medicine. The legal profession was just not amenable, and she was not able to find a job. She graduated second in her class from NYU Law School, one of the, kind of first real incubators of women in the law at the time, and she could not find a job. She tried and tried and tried. She had, even after she had sat on this commission in New York State where she, all but drafted the first serious workers' compensation law in the United States, even after that, she could not get a job practicing law. But going back to when she first graduated from law school, she had to have a job. She did not come from money. She, worked her way through all three of her degrees, through her Vassar BA, her MA in political economy, basically in sociology at Columbia, and her law degree at NYU. And upon graduation, she had to have a job to support herself. And when she could not, initially find something in law, she took a job with her friend, Paul Kellogg, someone she'd met through Greenwich House and met through Columbia, who was starting the Pittsburgh Survey, which was it turned out to be a huge and groundbreaking social science project looking at the city of Pittsburgh, then really the industrial capital of the United States, and examining, kind of in a multifaceted way, all these aspects of working class life. And Eastman was assigned to to look at industrial accidents, which, as you say, was a, kind of a rising social problem or rising divisibility in the United States, because many other countries in the world were responding to workplace accidents with legislation. In the United States, there were legal obstacles to doing so. Mainly, a legal obstacle that the legislation that she helped to draft and that New York State introduced bumped into later, which was the idea that essentially a corporation, kind of owned the labor of its employees, and the state did not have the authority to intervene in that private labor contract. And, the struggle for workers' compensation in New York and elsewhere in the country was to gain the legal standing, and to write the law in such a way as it could withstand constitutional challenges to make workers' compensation mandatory for companies, and to spread out liability, essentially, to have what she proposed was that, by all rights, industrial work is dangerous for everybody. And so by all rights, those risks, that everyday risks of doing work in an industrializing economy, should be shared by the businesses, by the workers, and by the consumers. As the law was established and as things were being practiced when she, sort of took to this work, the employees who could be injured or killed on the job, got next to nothing. Employers were really not responsible for those accidents and for those losses unless, a worker could prove that essentially there was negligence on the part of the employer, and furthermore could prove that no other worker involved had any responsibility for the accident that occurred. And so there were a lot of obstacles to, a worker, many of them immigrants, uneducated, who, even if they might have had the conditions to allow them to sue their employers for support after they were injured, probably wouldn't have had the clout and the knowledge and the ability, right, to seek legal representation and to enter the legal system.
And you're right. This really touched her based on a lot of her writing about this at the time. I mean, she was writing the report, which is what she was hired for. She would say things like, the families and the widows who were left behind, they weren't really interested in compensation. They were interested in safety. And she wrote about, women dying in factory fires and children. And a lot of the immigrants, which you mentioned, some of them were young. They were what we consider underage workers today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Some of the boys, she called them men, but they were really boys who were working in, running this enormous, dangerous machinery in industrial factories, could be 14, 15. She related to them as children, from a maternal point of view, but also, related to the loss to families. In these days, when a laborer died, he was generally the only wage earner in the family, or certainly the main wage earner in the family. And the wife and children would be left absolutely destitute and with, little or no prospects. And so she really saw this as a holistic problem and just responded with her heart as well as her head to the absolute injustice of these huge, growing, profitable companies exploiting their workers like this. And when they took their limbs, when they took their bodies, bearing next to no or no responsibility for helping those men and their families to survive.
She wasn't the only person, obviously, who was working on this issue, right? But the thing about it is that she wrote about it with a level of empathy that you didn't find with other people who were working on this from, say, like a legislative perspective.
Yes. To my read, she brought real heart and, as you say, real empathy to these questions. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about reading her important book that preceded her work, her appointment to this commission to work on workers' compensation, it was called Work Accidents and the Law. And this was the published version of the report that she wrote for Paul Kellogg and the Pittsburgh Survey. And she, not only went into these factories, went into these mines, interviewed these workers, and saw their homes, and really talked to them about their lives. But after workers were injured, she also went and talked to the families. She talked to the wives. She looked at their lives. She wrote about the ways that these families, tried to survive after the loss of their breadwinner, right? And their father and their husband, and wrote about the heroism of it. And, really gave a full round kind of heartfelt picture of the tragedy and the abuse that these families were suffering at the hands of these corporations that basically, could chew up and spit out workers, their lives, their bodies, their families, with no responsibility. She wrote about sometimes a small adjustment to, something on a factory floor and a piece of machinery, was well known. And for a negligible cost could have been repaired, but instead it maimed a worker, or killed one, and then another, and then another.
Thank you so much for listening. That concludes part 1 of my interview with Amy Aronson about the life of Crystal Eastman. Part 2 will air next week, and we'll discuss the latter part of Eastman's life, including how she came to co-found the ACLU. The Electorette is independently created and produced by me, Jen Taylor Skinner, and of course, I'm the host. But I also do all of the editing, the audio, and the graphics. You name it, it's on my plate. So if you enjoyed this episode of the Electorette, please help the Electorette grow by subscribing. Just hit the subscribe button on whatever app you use to listen to podcasts. Also leave a review for the Electorette on iTunes. Lastly, one final way to help the Electorette is by following the Electorette on social media. That's at Electorette on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep up the good fight.